Hello there. I'm going to cut that out of this video. Found this jade and solid copper cup at a thrift store. I couldn't resist them. That's why that stuff is sitting on the table. I love stuff that's made out of solid copper. You know, the one thing I keep getting asked over and over again in comments and live stream, I'm big into holography, by the way. Depends on, of course, we're talking about holographic universe. People talk about simulation. There's two different types of simulation, of course, but a lot of people ask about simulation and simulated universe. And I know they're getting a lot of this from movies, invariably so. There's all these ideas that the universe is a simulation. Of course, there's two different implications of simulation. Simulation meaning program, computer algorithm. The other definition of a simulation is an imitation of something. And it is true from the premise of logical, rational metaphysics, both Greek, Indian, and Egyptian. That's be more than both, all three of those together, and more, actually, that we're dealing with as far as psychophysical beings, imitation of ultimate reality. There is an algorithm, but it is not written by any divine or transcendent being. And, of course, numbers are not things themselves. Nature doesn't work in numbers, not even in the slightest. Numbers are, of course, symbolic enumerations. This is, of course, a concept of humanity. The hairy armpit, chick, and muddy feet nature of Mother Nature does not deal in numbers, rather in simplex pressure mediation. But we actually can have a symbolic representation, no different than hieroglyphics, of course, or a symbolic representation of metaphysical principles. By the way, that was not a lingua franca of ancient Egypt. That was actually a priestly language. Even back then, a lot of the lay people didn't understand the Egyptian hieroglyphics unless they were actually initiated into them. All the secrets of the universe are only secrets such that people are not interested in taking the time to understand the nature of something because they're so busy paying the bills and trying to keep themselves and or their family alive. The great secrets are easily revealed. I don't know about the word easily, but they're revealed with a proper methodology. And that methodology, of course, is metaphysics. You can't get there via physics. There's no measuring, of course, the measure, and that's what people don't get. This is the distinction between physics and metaphysics. But getting back to simulation and the so-called holographic universe, I grew up with a great love of holography. I was actually going to get into making holograms, but it's not that it's difficult. It requires an enormous amount of equipment, a super heavy table, basically in the basement. It has to be absolutely vibration proof, and I don't know if you know what a holographic positive is, for example, but every part of the hologram receives and records light from the entirety of the object. Not a holographic image that's on your credit card, for example. That's one. A true art hologram, which I have more than a few true art holograms, is, oh goodness, thousands of times more impressive. You can even buy them on eBay, but they're not cheap because it takes an enormous amount of effort to produce a true art hologram. They're thousands of times more impressive than the hologram, for example, on your credit card. The actual holography of the supercell or ferrocell, which I have another one actually coming to me, and I'm giving a demonstration using the supercell down when I give a lecture next week in Naples, Florida. They've already ordered one, and they have all the constituent components, and I could build one. And that's nature's true art hologram, and it's infinitely more impressive than a true art hologram, but which is itself 1,000 times more impressive than a credit card hologram. But every aspect of a holographic positive receives the entirety of the light from the object. I don't know if you actually know how a hologram is produced. There's countless videos on it. You actually have a beam splitter, and you have the laser light that's split, and you have the reference beam, and then you have the light that's reflected off the object to be rendered in the hologram. And when you actually take the holographic positive, it's like, well, there's the image in the middle, whatever it may be. It's like, well, down here in the bottom right corner, upper left corner, there's nothing there. That's part of the holographic positive. There's nothing down there. The object is right here. You can actually take out any minuscule section of any corner or any piece of it and the entirety of the image is still present within the whole of everything. Taken individually, the image is right there and there's nothing in the corners, for example, but you can reproject the laser through the holographic positive and you will see the entirety of the image in the place where you thought the image was not at all. This, of course, is fractal self-similarity. That which we consider beautiful, i.e. the logos of the one in nature. People say, well, this is the golden ratio, this is beauty in nature. It's like, well, it is, but the deeper understanding and the basis or foundation of metaphysics and understanding this holographic universe or this simulation, and the universe is a simulation, but not the type of simulation that you've been watching in movies where some being is divinely programmed, some spiritual or metaphysical algorithm to predict the nature of things as far as your choices in life, and then people start asking whether they have free will or not. Of course, free will is only potential, not actual. Nobody has free will until they actually have it, because free will is only potential and never actual. Self-actualization of free will, of course, is to become disobjectified from mere reactions. This, of course, is to gravitate against an animal existence, but that's a matter for another discussion. Phi is to 1 as 1 is to phi. 1, of course, being the absolute or the divine. Phi, of course, being the golden ratio or the logos. But phi is the projective geometry of the logos of the one, just as in exactly the same as the holographic positive, where the image is contained within every aspect and every part of the whole of the holographic positive. So, are we in a simulation? We're not in a computer algorithm or a program, but a simulation, the secondary definition of a simulation, of course, is an imitation of something. Is it an imitation, a projective geometry of what is ultimately true? And the answer is yes. Imitation of ultimate reality, the substrate of phenomena, because phi is to 1 as 1 is to phi. That's actually a mathematical absolute. But when you tell that to a mathematician, whose religion is counting things, and they think numbers are things, but once again, numbers are not things at all. They're the symbolic representators and enumeration of human concepts of things. You say, well, what's the significance of that? Because the significance is incredibly profound, and they won't give you the answer to that. Ultimately, when we talk about simulation and holography, we must, of course, talk about space, but space is not a thing at all, and space is ultimately no different than a shadow. Shadow is not a thing at all, and it has no principality. It is not a thing in of itself. Rather, the casting of the absence of light and the presence of forms. Shadow, of course, is the absence of light. What is space? I've said this a million times, that space is no different than a shadow. And by the way, Nikola Tesla has said many countless times that space has no properties. It, of course, has attributes, just as a shadow has an attribute. You stand in a shadow, you're going to feel cold because there's no light there. But that's not a property of the shadow. Rather, it's a property of what is absent, that being light. But that's, once again, not a property. It's an attribute. So space does have attributes, but the misrepresentation of this by atomists, who today are not actual scientists, rather mathematicians, is the reification of space as something. Because when you remove the ether, which you can't do because everything is in ether perturbation modality or compound modality thereof, you have to replace it with something else substantial as the foundation of the universe. And they replaced it with literally bumping particles in space. They think space can be warped and curved and all this. That's the only time Nikola Tesla actually, shall we say, foams at the mouth, not literally, but as against this idea that space has properties. And this is also, too, what he meant when he quoted, quoting him, his great statement that there are those who think deeply and those who can think clearly, but you have to be sane to be able to think clearly. So there are many, many deep thinkers out there, but they're rather off their rocker, and they cannot think clearly. So space is, of course, once again, like a shadow, the impotency of power, of energy or inertia. Magnetism, definitionally, which, of course, is the toroidal geometry. A torus, of course, has volume. It contains, well, not contains, it is of itself mass and magnitude. When you actually have mass and magnitude, then you have time. Time is a measure. By the way, the reification of time, which humanity has done, they've undeniably done, that's not my opinion, that's a hardcore fact. Time is a measure, but a measure is not a thing. I don't know if I have it over here. I got a digital caliper over here, and of course it's got a little measure on the side over here. Time as a measure is not a thing. A measure is not a thing. A measure is just a measure. Quantum, which means das Lichtwort, it comes from the principle and idea of the smallest unit of energy. It is itself a measure, but there is no such thing as quantum. The reification of an idea of a measure is illogical, it's insane, it's absurd, it's completely irrational. Would anybody on this earth with a half a brain say that a measure, whether that be 2 inches or 5 miles or 10 grams or 5 newtons or 6 Teslas or 8 joules or 1,000 volts or 1,000 amps, would they say that that is a thing? And the answer is no. A measure is only a measure. The after effect, of course, of a divergent magnetic field, which is the toroidal geometry that is magnetism itself, which is the second half of the conjugate geometry of the entire universe. Mother Nature is really, really simple, but human beings are really, 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 really that ignorant. Is, of course, the after effect thereof is, of course, the creation of space. But space is, of course, the impotency of power. We can say the impotency of energy or inertia. Time is, of course, once again a measure, and, of course, it measures decay of mass and movement. To talk about the logos and the simulation that is this universe is to talk about things that contain mass and magnitude. Denotatively, they must suffer time. Every ancient culture, once again, said time is the number 4, and the reason why, like hotels and motels in Japan and China, you could go look this up, they'll like skip floor number 4. They'll go like 1, 2, 3, 5. It's because they considered the ultimate taboo to like have a room. They'll skip the room number 4. They'll skip the floor number 4 because 4 means death. And death and time and space are one and the same thing. When you have space, you have time, because when you have space, you have mass and magnitude. When you have and the ancient Pali phrase is repeated over and over again, and it's really, really ancient. The Greeks have a similar one, the Pythagoreans actually, is when this is present, that is present. When this is not present, that is not. Like I got tomatoes in the kitchen, you know those little tiny flies? You know, they're always buzzing around fruit. It's like when tomatoes are present, you're going to have those little frickin' flies buzzing off of your tomatoes, those little tiny ones, right? Fruits and veggies. When you don't have any fruits or veggies in your kitchen, you won't see those little frickin' flies. You know, so when this is present, that is present. When you actually have mass and magnitude, you necessitatively, and this is where the Greeks came up with the word ananke. It doesn't mean necessity. It means it must necessarily exist, or it can't exist any other way. Space and time. Time and space are one and the same thing. Yeah, and the only number missing out of the first 5 digits of the Fibonacci sequence, by the way, i.e. the golden ratio, which is the logos of the perfect or the divine, as inflation. And I'm going to talk to an important point here I've not mentioned before. Nobody, actually, that I know of, even the Pythagoreans, nobody has mentioned this in any way, shape, or form. The first 5 digits missing the Fibonacci sequence is 4. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. The only number missing there is number 4, which corresponds to, as every ancient culture said, Greek, Indian, and Egyptian, time equals 4. But time is unreal. It is a measure. There is no such thing as a real measure. That's something, too, you should really think about. Space, when you have space, when this is present, that is present. Well, what's present when you have space? When you have space, you have mass and magnitude, and thence you must necessitatively have time. When you have time, you have, of course, the suffrage of time, because anything that undergoes time is beginning in time. It must necessitatively suffer and die, but nothing that is a measure, joules, watts, volts, amps, meters, miles, seconds, on and on. Every measure is not a thing. And this is why I'm always rolling my eyes and people, what about the quantum of this and the quantum of that? It's like, do you even know what the word quantum means? Because the great masters, Tesla, Faraday, Steinmetz, Heaviside, James Clerk Maxwell, Charles Proteus Steinmetz, Oliver Heaviside, these people had no use in developing the modern electrical world and having use of the word quantum, because there's nothing in nature, not you, not anybody, not any PhD professor, can point to and call it quantum. People will say, well, what about a quantum computer? Well, that's a reification of a concept. Quantum is not a thing. It is a measure. Talk about the interference logos, because, by the way, the algorithm of the universe, and of course Mother Nature, once again, does not deal in numbers. These are, of course, human conceptual symbolic enumerations of things that we see in nature. It is my discovery, and it's from Plato's Republic 509d to 511. If you actually do the math, it's actually arithmetic. It's not math. You do the arithmetic of Plato's Republic 509d to 511. It's a divided line section where you take a line, you cut it unevenly, and you take each one of those sections, you divide it unevenly, and you have phi, 1, 1, and 1 over phi, and 1 against phi to the power of negative 3, which is 0.23606, is an expression. And that expression, if you really want to know the computer algorithm, then it's not a computer algorithm at all, but the algorithm in human conceptual enumeration. It's the reason why I tattooed it right here on the inside of my right wrist, is 1 over phi to the power of negative 3. And this is the attribute as against the 1. People say, well, that's a number. That's phi cubed, or 4.23606. Like, no. When you put 1 over phi to the power of negative 3, that itself, by itself, not the resultant, which is phi cubed, which is equals totality, or what the Greeks would call pan, or 4.23606, which includes the cosmos noitos and the cosmos atitos, i.e. the visible universe and the metaphysical universe, and the ratio and proportionality thereof, is an expression. Just taking this by itself without doing the math thereof. This expression is the principle and the attribute as against. That would be no different than calling the light 1 and phi to the power of negative 3 illumination. When you have light and illumination, i.e. principle and attribute, which are not two things, rather one thing, and this is the reason why the first two digits of Fibonacci sequence are 1 and 1. Go look that up. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5. Once again, what are the first two digits? 1 and 1. The second one is not a second 1 at all. It is the attribute. This would be the agathon, and this would be the euristos dias. It's like saying light and illumination. 1 over phi to the power of negative 3 is no different than saying 1 as against 1, or principle over attribute. So we have this interference logo between the conjugate geometry of the entire universe, and then we have, of course, the simulated universe. The simulation would be this algorithm, but there's no supreme being that came up with this. That's completely illogical. It's just principle and attribute, and the ultimate monistic metaphysics of the Pythagoreans, the Platonists, the Neoplatonists, Iamblichus Proclus, Numenius Syrianus, Advaita Vedanta, original Buddhism, the Egyptians, on and on and on. But this interference logos, think of the curvilinear forms of the fight between the magnetic and the dielectric, like that you see underneath the supercell. People say, well, you see lines and you see the specific toroidal, hyperboloidal geometry, which is the negative image of one another. This is the yin and the yang of the entire universe. That's the constructive and destructive interference. So this interference logos is the beauty in absolutely all forms. Now this is a cross-section, a real, this is real by the way, these are really fragile, of a nautilus shell. People say, well, there's the golden ratio, and there's beauty, and I recognize it. And I say, what does that mean? This is all true. Everything you said is true. But we need to get to the root of why it is. What is the nature of something? Somebody say, well, there's a horse. People ride them, and they're really cool. And I say, well, yeah, but what's the nature? What is the essence of a horse? What is horseness? What is the essence, or essa, of the golden ratio, or that which we call beautiful? And it is the interference logos between the one and the extrinsic attribute of the one, which is no different than saying the fight between one and its attribute, or like the fight between one and light and illumination. We have necessitatively the objective presentation, i.e. the interference logos, but that's the reason why there's no straight lines in the universe. All lines in the universe are curvilinear. There is not a single straight line in Mother Nature's universe, not even one. Everything is curvilinear. That's no different. This is curvilinear. Isn't this a curve? And this curve is what we view as beautiful, and it is beautiful. And we actually would start right here at the center where 1 would be, and also to its attribute, phi to the power of negative 3. So the fight between the 1 and the curvilinear expression of the interference logos, the curvilinear forms, i.e. the fight between the magnetic and the dielectric, i.e. inertial and centrifugal, which is force and motion, inertia and acceleration, and the fight thereof. Fight's not really an accurate word. Then we have necessitatively this interference logo, which objectively manifests that which we call the beautiful. And this is beautiful by any definition. Here's another logarithmic, interference pattern. And this, of course, is curvilinear from any aspect you look at it. This is a real shell, by the way. We have beauty, the beauty of beautiful shapes, beautiful forms, beauty in nature. But what do we mean by beauty? We mean by beauty the interference logos between the one and the extrinsic attribute. The curvilinear forms, which are the fight, which is not an accurate word, between magnetic and dielectric, or the yin and the yang of the universe. That's like saying the fight between light and illumination. Lines of growth, and of course the logos between forms and their creation, i.e. the one, i.e. between phi and 1, because phi is to 1 as 1 is to phi. Well, phi is 1.618, yada, 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 033, so. Well, no, that's a number. Human beings have numbers. They're symbolic representators of things that we see in nature, but nature does not have numbers. She deals in pressure mediations, and the logos of the divine manifests as that which we identify as beautiful. But when we have space, we necessitatively must have time. This projective geometry, the creation of space, which is the impotency of power, the impotency of inertia, then we have mass and magnitude, and then of course we have its measure, which is time. But there is nothing in nature that is a measure. Measures were dreamt up by humans. Do you have any premise, any radical premise that if Mother Nature was a living person, that she would have any idea of measures like inches, miles, volts, amps, centimeters, liters, decaliters, kilometers, grams, ounces? Quantum, by definition, not my idea or feeling or belief, is a measure. There is nothing in nature that is a measure. Measures were dreamt up by human beings to quantify things. Das Lichtwand, smallest unit of energy measure. There is nothing in nature, by the way, that is quantum. Look at that! There's a quantum phenomenon in Mother Nature. No. There is no such nonsense. That is a religious, pseudo-religious, it's actually scientific religious, which is actually the new type of science. Remember when South Park made a video about the future where everybody's a scientist, but the scientists have their own different religions? Like, instead of like saying praise God, they would say praise science. They would do horrible things against one another in the name of science. Praise science! Remember that? Like the future, in the distant future, they're like otters fighting turtles or something like that, but they're all nihilistic, atomistic scientists, but they've developed a religion of different perspectives on science. It's kind of funny. It's kind of, talk about accurately predicting the nature of things. I don't actually sit around watching those videos, but I think they're really kind of funny. So, are we in a simulation in a holographic universe? We are, but there's nobody that programmed that. You can believe whatever you want. What people believe is no interest in me. I'm interested in facts, logic, and wisdom. Simulation is an imitation of something, of a substratum of ultimate reality that sits underneath phenomena. This is true because there are two selves in all forms of metaphysics. One is the simulation or holographic self, and one is the real self. Greek, Indian, and Egyptian metaphysics all say this specifically. Two selves, the psychophysical self, Rupa, Vedana, Sana, Sankara, and Vijnana in ancient Pali, or Nama Rupa, forms, feelings, perceptions, impulses, and existential consciousness. This is the simulation or holographic self. This radio with antenna, battery, yada, 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 speaker, that is the simulation or holographic self. The real self or transcendent self is the signal that is not in this radio, but everywhere and nowhere. It's like, where is it? Here, there? No, it's everywhere. Well, that doesn't make any sense. That sounds like religion. It's like, no, the signal's everywhere and nowhere. I can't point to it. Don't take the analogy too far and get into discussing the broadcast station. There's where the radio analogy breaks down. It is the case of water, too, by the way. The holographic nature of consciousness is in the logos of the perfect geometry of water. The reason why that's the only one symbol of the ancient Pythagoreans is the 108, 36, 36-degree triangle, which makes up the Pythagorean pentagram, is also, too, the exact geometry of water, and is the only perfect, literally the only perfect, incommensurable geometry in the entire universe. And Ah, I'm sure there's a total coincidence that that perfect geometry, the one and only perfect geometry, also makes up that which makes life possible. Without it, life is impossible. Water. Need water to have life. Yep. No. This is the true metaphysics of the holographic or simulation universe. I mean, I could go on and on about this in many countless videos. I've only scratched the surface in discussing this, you know, without boring people to death within a 25-minute time window frame. But let me know if you're interested in going deeper down that rabbit hole, because I sure can. But then I must ask the questions like, well, how deep do I go down the rabbit hole before people like roll their eyes in the back of their head and go, oh my God, it's too deep already. That's up for you to decide. You ever want to contact me, my information is in the description below. Any donation is always warmly welcome in the description below. Have a lovely week. Lux e Veritas. Goodbye.